The figure was wrong against the snow. That was the first thing Silas Kane noticed. Everything else in Redemption, Wyoming, was a study in gray and white this deep in the winter of 1878. The clapboard buildings were gray, the sky was a sheet of gray wool, and the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, bleaching the world. But the figure standing near the stagecoach depot was a slash of color, a smudge of pink against the monochrome landscape. Silas pulled his horse, Bess, to a halt, the mare snorting a cloud of steam into the frigid air. He had ridden into town for salt pork and coffee, a simple errand that should have taken an hour. Now, this. He was a man who preferred to mind his own business. His homestead was 5 miles out, isolated by design, and he liked it that way. But he couldn't look away. The figure was a woman. She was small, dressed in a gray silk tunic and trousers that looked painfully thin for the Wyoming cold. The slash of color was a pink scarf wrapped around her neck, the fabric already damp with melting snow. She stood perfectly still, clutching the handle of a single, battered suitcase, her other hand holding the collar of her tunic closed at her throat. She was Chinese, her face pale and her dark eyes wide, scanning the empty street as if expecting someone who was never going to arrive. Silas watched as folks hurried past her. The blacksmith, the telegraph clerk, a pair of ranchers heading into the saloon. They either didn't see her or chose not to. They angled their bodies away, pulling their hats down low, creating a small, invisible bubble of indifference around her. She was being erased from the landscape even as she stood in it. He could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way she held her shoulders rigid against the biting wind. She was not just cold, she was alone in a way that felt dangerous. He knew what this was. He'd heard the stories. A man here would send for a bride from back home, a picture and a promise exchanged through letters that took months to cross the ocean and the continent. Sometimes, the man got cold feet. Sometimes, he died. Sometimes, he just never existed in the first place. For the woman, it was a dead end, thousands of miles from anyone she knew, with no money and no words to ask for help. Silas sighed, the sound swallowed by the falling snow. This was not his trouble. His trouble was a leaky barn roof and the price of coffee beans. He nudged Bess forward, intending to ride on to the general store. But his eye snagged on her face again. There was no panic in it. Just a profound, bone-deep weariness, and a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the entire uncaring town. He stopped his horse again, this time right in front of her. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were dark and clear, and held no plea. She simply looked at him, waiting. He was a big man, weathered by the sun and wind, and he knew he probably looked intimidating in his heavy sheepskin coat. He dismounted, his boot sinking into the fresh powder. He stood a few feet away, not wanting to crowd her. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect his father had taught him was owed to all women, regardless of their station. Snowflakes immediately began to melt in his dark hair. He said, his voice a low rumble. It felt loud in the quiet street. Are you waiting for someone? She watched his lips move, a small frown creasing her brow. She understood the tone, if not the words. She gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He tried again, pointing a gloved finger toward the stagecoach depot. The stage is gone for the day. Next one ain't for 3 days, if the pass stays clear. Still nothing. She just watched him, her stillness a stark contrast to the swirling snow. He saw it then, the faint blue tint to her lips. She had been out here for a long time. He could leave. He could ride on, get his supplies, and be back at his warm cabin before dusk. No one would blame him. In fact, most would think him a fool for even stopping. But the image of her standing here alone as night fell, as the temperature dropped and the town shuttered its doors, was one he knew he wouldn't be able to forget. He was not a man of many words, so he chose the few he had carefully. He looked at her suitcase, then back at her face. He gestured vaguely in the direction of his homestead, out past the edge of town. "I've got a spare room," he said, slowly and clearly. He wasn't sure if she understood the words, but she must have understood the intention. Her composure, the rigid wall she had built around herself, finally cracked. Her dark eyes filled with tears, which she refused to let fall. A shudder ran through her entire body, a tremor of cold and relief so profound it seemed to shake her to her soul. She dipped her head in a short, formal bow, a gesture of gratitude so poignant it made something tighten in Silas's chest. He reached down and took the handle of her suitcase. It was surprisingly light. He tied it securely behind his saddle, then turned back to her. He offered her his hand to help her up onto the horse. She hesitated for only a second before placing her small, cold hand in his. He lifted her easily onto Bess's back, seating her in front of the saddle. He mounted behind her, his large frame a shield against the wind. As they rode out of town, he felt her shivering against him. Without a word, he unwrapped his own woolen scarf from his neck and carefully draped it over her shoulders, on top of her thin pink one. She tensed for a moment, then relaxed into the warmth. They rode in silence, the only sound the soft crunch of Bess's hooves in the snow, leaving the town of Redemption and its cold shoulders behind them. The cabin was small, just one room with a sleeping loft above. It was built of sturdy pine logs, chinked tight against the wind. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a fire was already banked low, casting a warm glow. It was a man's space, tidy but sparse. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding tins of food and a few worn books. Silas helped her down from the horse and led her inside. The wave of warmth from the hearth made her sigh. He gestured to the chair nearest the fire. "Sit. Get warm." She obeyed, sinking into the chair and holding her hands out to the flames. Silas stoked the fire, adding more logs until it was roaring. He then went about the simple tasks of caring for his horse and bringing in the supplies he'd managed to grab. When he came back inside, she was still in the chair, her eyes closed, the exhaustion plain on her face. He hadn't even asked her name. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and sliced thick pieces of bacon into a cast-iron skillet. The smell of frying meat and coffee soon filled the small cabin. He glanced at her. Her eyes were open now, watching him. "My name is Silas," he said, pointing to his chest. "Silas." She watched him, then pointed a delicate finger at herself. "My Lynn," she said, her voice soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. My, he repeated. It was a nice name. He served up 2 plates of bacon and eggs, along with thick slices of bread. He set one on the table, then brought the other to her, placing it on a small crate next to her chair. She looked at the food as if she hadn't eaten in days. She probably hadn't. She ate slowly at first, then with a quiet urgency that confirmed his suspicion. When they were done, he took her plate. He pointed to the ladder leading up to the loft. "The bed is up there. It's yours. I'll sleep down here." She looked from the ladder to the pallet of blankets he was already laying out for himself near the hearth. A look of protest crossed her face. She shook her head, pointing at him and then the ladder. "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You take the bed. It's warmer." He made a shooing motion with his hands. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by another wave of that profound gratitude. She bowed her head again before climbing the ladder. The next 2 days, the storm raged. The world outside the cabin windows was a howling vortex of white. They were sealed in together. A strange, quiet rhythm developed between them. Silas tended the fire, shoveled a path to the barn to care for Bess, and read his books. Mai, after a day of rest, began to move about the cabin with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. She found his mending basket, a tangled mess of thread and torn shirts. With nimble fingers, she repaired a tear in his favorite canvas jacket, her stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. She took his meager supplies, flour, dried beans, salt pork, and created a savory, simmering stew that filled the cabin with a delicious aroma he'd never managed himself. She did not speak much, but her action spoke volumes. She was repaying his kindness in the only way she could, by turning his functional shelter into a comfortable home. On the 3rd day, the snow stopped. The sun came out, glittering on a landscape transformed into a sea of pristine white. Their supplies were running low. "We need to go to town," Silas said, pulling on his boots. Mai nodded, her face impassive. She wrapped her pink scarf around her neck, its brightness a small act of defiance against the cold world that awaited them. Henderson's general store was the social hub of redemption. It smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and wood smoke. It was also warm, and half a dozen townspeople were gathered around the pot-bellied stove. When Silas walked in with Mai a step behind him, the conversation stopped. Every head turned. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. Silas ignored them, walking directly to the counter where Jed Henderson stood, wiping it down with a rag. Henderson was a portly man with a sour disposition and a proprietary air. He watched Mai with narrowed eyes. "Silas," he said, his voice flat. "Need something?" "Coffee, flour, and a side of bacon," Silas said, keeping his tone even. Henderson moved slowly, deliberately. He retrieved the items, slamming them down on the counter one by one. "That all?" For now, Silas pulled out his leather pouch for the coin. Henderson leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial grumble that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, folks are talking, Silas. Bringing her to your place. It ain't right." Silas felt a familiar surge of anger, the kind he usually kept tamped down. He set his jaw. "What I do on my own property is my business, Jed." "Is it?" Henderson sneered. "This is a decent town. We don't want her kind causing trouble." Before Silas could respond, Mai stepped forward. She looked directly at Henderson, her expression calm, her posture erect. She said nothing, but her gaze was so steady, so devoid of fear or shame, that Henderson was the one who looked away first, flustered. She had not challenged him, but she had refused to be cowed by him. Silas paid for his goods, his movements clipped. He gathered the sack, and they turned to leave. As they reached the door, Henderson's voice cut through the silence again, this time directed at another customer. "Can't trust them. Any of them." Silas stopped, his hand on the door latch. He turned back slowly. The men by the stove shifted, suddenly very interested in the toes of their boots. Henderson flushed, not expecting to be called on it. But Silas just looked at him, a long, cold look that promised consequences. Then he opened the door and walked out, Mai following silently behind him. They were almost back to the cabin when the trouble started. 2 men on horseback blocked the narrow trail. Silas didn't recognize them. They weren't local ranchers. They were drifters, the kind that floated from one dirty job to the next, with mean eyes and cheap whiskey on their breath. "Well, well," the first one said, a grin splitting his unshaven face. "Look what we have here. A homesteader and his little pet." Silas reined Bess in, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Let us pass." "I don't think so," the second man said, dismounting. He walked toward them, his movements loose and arrogant. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't like complications." "And she," he said, pointing a grubby finger at Mai, "is a complication." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Marcus Blackwood owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory. He was a man who bought politicians, bent the law, and crushed anyone who got in his way. "We don't have any business with Blackwood," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "You do now," the man sneered, and lunged for Bess's bridle. What happened next was a blur of motion. Silas swung his leg over the saddle, dropping to the ground and shoving the man back. The second rider spurred his horse forward. Silas drew his pistol, but before he could aim, the first man was on him. They crashed into the snow, trading blows. Silas was stronger, but the man was wiry and fought dirty. From the corner of his eye, Silas saw the second man dismount and grab Mai, pulling her from the horse. She cried out, a sharp sound of fear. That sound focused Silas. He threw his opponent off, scrambling to his feet. But Mai was not helpless. As the man dragged her, she twisted, stomping down hard on his instep with the heel of her boot. He howled in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She broke free and ran, not away, but toward the cabin's woodpile. The man, enraged, started after her. That was the opening Silas needed. He drove his fist into the first man's jaw, a solid, cracking blow that sent him stumbling back. He turned his pistol on the second man. "Get away from her." The man froze, his hand hovering over his own holstered gun. His partner was groaning on the ground. The odds had changed. With a curse, he helped his partner onto his horse. "This ain't over," he spat. Blackwood gets what he wants. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving tracks of churned-up snow in their wake. Silas's heart was pounding. He holstered his pistol and went to Mai. She was standing by the woodpile, her chest heaving, her face pale but her eyes blazing with defiance. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the trail where the men had disappeared. The shared danger hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. The quiet peace of their sanctuary had been shattered. Now, the real question was why. What business could a powerful man like Marcus Blackwood have with an abandoned bride? Back inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire felt different. It was no longer a cozy refuge but a small, fragile bastion against a hostile world. Silas bolted the door and checked the load in his rifle. Mai put a kettle on for tea, her movements precise and calm, as if her hands knew what to do even when her mind was reeling. When she handed him a steaming mug, their fingers brushed. The small contact sent a jolt through him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the quiet, grateful woman he had taken in. He saw the steel in her spine, the fire she had shown facing down Henderson, the fierce courage she displayed against Blackwood's thugs. He sat down at the table, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. "Mai," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "You need to tell me who Marcus Blackwood is. Why does he want you gone?" She stood by the hearth, her back to him for a long moment. He could see the tension in her shoulders. He waited, letting the silence stretch. He knew that forcing her would do no good. Trust had to be given, not taken. Finally, she turned. Her face was etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to age her. She walked to her suitcase, which she'd kept neatly in a corner. She opened it and took out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. She brought it to the table and carefully unwrapped it. Inside were a half-dozen letters, the paper thin and worn, covered in elegant Chinese characters. On top of them was a daguerreotype, a small, formal portrait of a young Chinese man with kind eyes and a hopeful smile. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Lee." She pushed the photograph across the table to Silas. He picked it up carefully. The young man looked strong and decent. He was to be my husband, she corrected herself, her English precise, practiced. Silas realized she understood more than she let on. She had been listening, learning. "We were matched. He came here 2 years ago to work. He wrote me letters. He said he was saving money. We were going to open a small laundry in Cheyenne. A good life." She traced the edge of the top letter with her finger. "He worked for Mr. Blackwood. On the railroad spur line he is building to his mine," her voice faltered. "My last letter from him, he said the work was dangerous. Mr. Blackwood pushed the men too hard. Not enough timber for the supports in the tunnels. He said some men were afraid." She looked up, her eyes meeting Silas's. "The letter I received in San Francisco, the one with the ticket, it was not from Lee. It was from his friend. He said Lee was gone. An accident. A collapse in the tunnel, a week before I was to arrive." The pieces clicked into place for Silas. It wasn't just a random tragedy. "Blackwood," he said, the name tasting like ash. "His friend wrote that Mr. Blackwood called it bad luck," Mai continued, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "He paid the other workers a few dollars and told them to be quiet. He did not want a territorial investigation. It would slow down the work. When he learned I was coming, he was angry. A widow, here, asking questions, it is a complication. So Blackwood hadn't just abandoned her at the depot. He had left her there to freeze, hoping the problem would solve itself. The cold-blooded cruelty of it made Silas's blood run cold. She was a living, breathing reminder of his negligence, of a man's life he valued less than a few feet of railroad track. The next morning, Blackwood came himself. He rode a magnificent black stallion and wore a tailored black coat that must have cost more than Silas's entire homestead. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a banker with a clean-shaven face, silvering hair at his temples, and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He dismounted and strode to the cabin door, knocking as if he were paying a social call. Silas opened it, blocking the doorway. "Mr. Kane," Blackwood said smoothly, his smile widening. "Marcus Blackwood. May I have a word?" "You're having one," Silas said flatly. Blackwood's smile tightened. "I believe we have a mutual problem." A piece of misplaced property. He glanced past Silas, his eyes finding Mai, who stood by the fire, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to be generous to see this problem resolved." He reached into his coat and produced a heavy leather pouch, tossing it onto the small table just inside the door. It landed with a solid, metallic clink. "Gold. $100, Blackwood said. "For you to put her on the next stagecoach east. No questions asked. A man like you could do a lot with that kind of money. Fix up this place. Buy some cattle." It was a fortune. It was more money than Silas had seen in 5 years. It was the answer to a dozen different problems. He could buy a new plow, seed for the spring, a proper bull. He could be comfortable. Safe. He looked at the gold, gleaming on his rough table. Then he looked at Mai. She was watching him, her face pale, but her eyes held no fear. They held a quiet, steady trust. She believed in him, in the decency of the man who had offered a stranger a spare room. To take that money would be to betray not just her, but the best part of himself. Silas slowly reached down, picked up the pouch, and tossed it back to Blackwood. "She's not property," Silas said, his voice level. "And she's not going anywhere." Blackwood caught the pouch, his smile finally vanishing. His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You are making a grave mistake, Kane. I have friends in the land office. Homestead claims can get lost. Accidents happen. You'll find this land is much harder to hold onto than you think." The threat was clear. He was threatening Silas's home, his future, everything he had worked for. "Get off my land," Silas said. Blackwood stared at him for a long, venomous moment, then turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away. The air he left behind felt poisoned. Silas closed the door and slid the bolt home. He turned to face Mai. The cabin was silent, but everything had changed. It was no longer his fight. It was theirs. 3 months passed. The deep snows of winter gave way to the slow, muddy thaw of spring. The world outside the cabin turned from white to brown, then to a tentative green. The threat from Blackwood never materialized in a direct way, but his shadow lingered. Credit at the general store was suddenly denied. A promised contract to supply firewood to the smithy was mysteriously withdrawn. They were isolated, an island in a sea of Blackwood's influence. But inside the cabin, and on the small patch of land around it, something new was taking root. They worked. They had to. Survival demanded it. Silas cleared a new patch of land for planting, the axe ringing in the crisp spring air. He reinforced the barn roof he'd been worrying about all winter. He taught Mai how to handle the old rifle, her hand surprisingly steady, her aim true. Mai, in turn, transformed the homestead. She planted a small garden near the cabin door, coaxing tender shoots of greens and herbs from the cold soil. She organized his chaotic pantry, stretching their dwindling supplies with a skill that bordered on magical. She brought a quiet order to his life that he hadn't known was missing. They worked side by side, often in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled with the language of shared tasks and mutual reliance. He learned the meaning of her different smiles, the small, private one when a seed sprouted, the brighter one when he praised her cooking. She learned to read the set of his shoulders, to know when he was tired or worried. Then, word trickled in from town. There had been another accident, this one at Blackwood's silver mine. A rock slide. But this time, the man who died wasn't a nameless Chinese laborer. He was the youngest son of a federal judge from back east. Suddenly, there were questions that Blackwood couldn't silence with a few gold coins. A territorial marshal arrived from Cheyenne, a man with cold eyes who wasn't on Blackwood's payroll. Investigations were launched. Deeds were scrutinized. Payrolls were examined. Blackwood's empire, built on intimidation and cut corners, began to crumble under the weight of official inquiry. He was too busy saving himself to worry about a stubborn homesteader and a Chinese widow. The shadow over them lifted. One afternoon, Silas and I rode into town for supplies. The atmosphere was different. The stares they received were no longer hostile, but curious, tinged with a grudging respect. At the general store, Jed Henderson, who had once sneered at them, nodded curtly. "Heard you got your south field plowed, Silas," he said, almost friendly. "I can let you have some seed corn on credit, if you need it." It was more than just an offer of credit. It was an apology. An acceptance. Silas nodded. "I appreciate that, Jed." As they left, a woman who lived on a neighboring claim stopped my. "Mrs. Kane," she began, then faltered, blushing. "My wasn't Mrs. Kane, not officially." The woman hurried on, "I mean Im. My tomatoes are getting a blight. I saw your garden. It's the best in the valley. I was wondering, could you tell me your secret?" My looked at Silas, a small, surprised smile on her face. She then turned to the woman and, in her careful English, began to explain the way she mixed wood ash into the soil. That evening, back at the cabin, a comfortable quiet settled over them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Silas sat on the porch steps, mending a piece of harness. Mai came out and sat on the step beside him, handing him a cup of tea. She had taken to wearing her pink scarf tied in her hair, a bright ribbon of color against her dark braid. He looked at her hands, busy now with mending one of his shirts. They were no longer the pale, delicate hands of the woman who had arrived in the snow. They were capable, suntanned, with a few small calluses. They were the hands that had planted a garden, cooked their meals, and helped build a life here. He reached out and gently touched the sleeve of the shirt she was mending. The stitches were perfect, a line of reinforcement that made the fabric stronger than it had been before. "You have good hands," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Mai looked up from her sewing. She looked at his own hands, large and calloused, resting on the worn leather of the harness. They were the hands that had chopped the wood that kept them warm, that had defended her, that had offered her a home when the world had offered her nothing. A soft smile touched her lips. "So do you," she replied. They sat together, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. No grand declarations were needed. They had faced the winter and won. Home was not a place they had found. It was the thing they had built together, stitch by stitch, furrow by furrow, in the quiet spaces between them. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.